People always said about Petrosian that his great strength was positional chess and his ability to anticipate his opponent's threats before they ever occurred. And of course, this was a great strength. But do not underestimate the capacity for Petrosian to attack. When he wanted to attack his opponent's king, he was vicious. And this game is an example of that, and played at the absolute highest level. A world championship match, this one against Boris Spassky. The match Petrosian won. He would later, Spassky would later win the world championship 3 years later. But this game is really, really beautiful. I think you're going to enjoy it. Petrosian has black, Spassky has white. Let us jump right in. Spassky begins with d4, then knight f6, knight f3, e6, and bishop to g5 was played. Of course, the most common is c4. But bishop g5, a Torre attack, was played by Spassky. An interesting strategy because Petrosian himself played this opening. Sort of the idea that you would play your opponent's own opening against them to get a psychological edge. Well, we'll see if that works here. I think we already know, right? d5 is played by Petrosian, just classical chess. Bishop e7, e3, knight b to d7, bishop to d3, c5, and c3. And we just have a very standard orthodox Torre attack. And of course, the only real strategic problem black has is this queen's bishop, as it always seems to be in these queen pawn openings. So Petrosian deals with that by playing b6. The bishop can go to b7, and some variations even to a6. But after castling, he does play the bishop to b7, and that makes it harder for white to break free with e4, and he even might jump into e4 with his own knight later with that bishop at b7 supporting it. So Spassky sort of beats him to it. He plays knight to e5 first, inviting this exchange, which takes place knight e5, d e5, knight to d7. So we're beginning to see the outlines of the middle game develop. And the main move for white here by far is to just go ahead and take on e7. After queen takes, play f4. And after the game, Petrosian said this was probably what Spassky should have done. But he decides really a more aggressive idea, bishop to f4. Of course, that protects this pawn with a piece, but it leaves pieces on the board. I mean, that is a fundamental rule, right? If you have more space, you want to keep pieces on the board. So in that sense, it makes sense what Spassky does. However, there is one problem, and Kasparov pointed this out in his analysis of the game. You'll notice Petrosian has not yet castled. And that means that he can play aggressively with his kingside pawns because he hasn't committed his king to the g8 square yet. So after queen to c7, he puts pressure on e5, attacks it a second time, knight f3 to defend the pawn, and now h6. And we see the beginning of Petrosian's aggression on the king side, preparing to advance to g5 and then hide the king over on the queen side, and then just attack over on the king side. Anticipating that, Spassky plays b4, right? He knows the king is probably going to the queen side, so he wants to open lines on that side of the board as quickly as possible. g5 from Petrosian, bishop g3, and h5. So we see he's not messing around. These h and g pawns are coming in hard and hot. h4 is threatening to trap that bishop at g3, so he has to do something. If he plays h3, then just g4 begins to crack open lines on the king side. So instead, he plays h4. And if black plays g4, then after knight to d2, these pawns sort of block the h and g files. So Petrosian wants those files to be open. So he goes ahead and takes on h4, and now he has a half-open g file to work with. If the pawn is taken, then after bishop takes, black can take on e5 and has a very nice position. So because of that, bishop to f4 is played by Spassky. He doesn't take the pawn at h4. And now Petrosian castles long. a4, looking to open up lines on the queen side. And by the way, these next two moves from Petrosian are extremely instructive. They might be the most instructive moves of the game. He first plays the move c4, locking it up with a gain of tempo against this bishop. He doesn't want these lines to become opened. So the bishop goes to e2, but then watch this move, a6. a very powerful idea. It looks like a nothing move, right? You're just playing the a6, but the reason he does that is so he can lock up this king side. So if, for example, b5 is played, he can play a5. And of course, if a5 is played, he can play b5. So he can, no matter what white does advancing these pawns, he can advance the opposite pawn and lock it up. So Spassky plays king to h1 to get off of that g file. Rook d to g8, the rook comes in, rook g1, and now rook to g4, preparing the other rook to go to g8 and doubling up on that half-open file. Very simple chess. Queen to d2 connecting the rooks, rook h to g8. Now he is doubled on that g file. Spassky does go ahead and play a5, and as we mentioned, b5 from Petrosian. And now this structure is completely locked. And if Spassky wants to break through over here, he would have to give up a piece, sacrifice a piece if he wanted to break through there. At the moment, he can't even do that. Rook a to d1, trying to put some pressure on this pawn and maybe play e4 at some point to crack that open. Now, bishop to f8. One potential idea here could be bishop to g7 to encircle this pawn at e5. That's a possibility. But now Spassky plays knight to h2. He's attacking this rook with the knight and also the bishop at e2. But by moving his knight to h2, he now no longer defends the e5 pawn. So Petrosian, always eager to sacrifice an exchange, goes ahead and takes the pawn at e5. White takes on g4, and black takes on g4 with the pawn. So while he has given up an exchange, Petrosian has two pawns. So material is equal, and of course, these h and g pawns are in a very strong position to attack white's king. e4 from Spassky. One possible idea here with this move is maybe to play queen to e3 and maybe get that queen over by black's king and cause a little trouble. Bishop to d6 from Petrosian, of course, relieving the pressure and the pin on that e5 knight. The queen goes to e3, but now the knight goes back to d7. Bishops come off. And here, I have to admit, I don't really understand this move from Spassky. Rook to d4. Maybe he's inviting Petrosian's next move, because it seems like the most obvious move on the board, and that's e5. Kicking that rook with tempo and gaining space in the middle of the board. It does make this d5 point a little more sensitive, but it does force him to retreat. And here, this next move, very strong from Petrosian, f5, just coming in. We see he has a huge center and a potential attacking play on the king side. Black has a very nice position. If white takes on f5, then just a move like queen to f6, and you have threats of h3, opening up this long diagonal, followed by d4. Queen can just take the pawn at f5. That would be bad news. So Spassky takes on d5 instead, but now f4, gaining more and more space, hitting the queen with tempo. That queen goes to e4. Knight to f6 hits the queen again. Queen to f5 check, so the king just moves over to b8. Now f3 from white, trying to slow down those pawns. Bishop c8 hits the queen and puts this bishop in a much nicer attacking position. After queen to b1, g3 is played. And we can see that Petrosian is looking to play h3, supported by this bishop at c1, breaking through on the king side. Rook to e1, making room for the bishop to go to f1 without blocking in that rook and helping to control some of these light squares. h3, Petrosian continues with his attack. Now bishop to f1, and it would be a mistake here to play h2. It looks strong, this king is stuck on h1, but it closes up all of the lines, and it's very hard for black to get any play. He wants to keep lines open. So he just plays rook to h8, potentially threatening this king at h1. gh3, bishop h3, king to g1 to get away from that rook. Bishop f1, king f1, and now, boom, e4, just rolling in the center. If he were to take on e4, then f3, and he would be threatening rook to h1 mate, and obviously that attack would be unstoppable. So instead, queen to d1 is played. to help support it. The queen could go to f3 perhaps here. And here the simplest move is actually queen to d7, threatening queen to h3 check, but Petrosian sacrifices a piece. He doesn't have to, but he does, which you think that's out of character, but he plays the nice move, knight to g4. Says you can have the piece, but I want these really powerful pawns. Spassky does take the piece, but then f3. And look at these nice arrangement of pawns, and he is threatening rook to h1, checkmate. Spassky's up a rook, but what can he do? He plays rook to g2 with the idea, obviously, the rook could come back, but he's giving up that rook. But it doesn't matter. After f takes g2 check, Boris Spassky resigned. Let's look at a variation to see why. After king g2, rook to h2 check, king to g1, and then just queen to h6 is, just wins. Threatening rook to h1 after, say, queen to d4, for example, rook h1, queen h2 would be mate. There are some other moves, but they all lead to a clear, easy win for black. So Petrosian doesn't play the game of anticipating. He went right for his opponent in this a masterpiece of attacking play from a world championship game. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.